Hello, history lovers. It's been said that behind every great man is a great woman. And with this being Women's History Month, I really wanted to talk about a very special woman. Thanks to the musical, everybody has learned a lot about Alexander Hamilton. I remember when I was in middle school, the only time I ever read anything about Alexander Hamilton in the school textbook was just a brief little side blurb about the infamous duel. But you won't find his wife Eliza mentioned in any history textbook that you're gonna study in college or high school. And that is a real shame. That's a tragedy because this woman accomplished so much throughout her whole life, before her marriage, during her marriage, and after Alexander's death. She lived such an incredible life. She made sure that her husband's story was told. And she absolutely deserves to have her own story talked about, even though she wasn't really someone to look for the focus during her lifetime. Eliza really was never one to try to grab the spotlight. She was actually one of 7 siblings that made it to adulthood. The musical focuses on 2 of her sisters besides her, Angelica and Peggy. She was, of course, especially close with Angelica. They were the best of friends throughout their lives. They were absolutely inseparable. But there were a couple details that the musical left out, and I understand why. You're covering a long time span from the beginning of the Revolutionary War to 1804. So, quite a few years in between there, a lot of events, a lot going on. Something's got to get left out. But she actually, like I said, she's one of 7 siblings that lived to adulthood. Unlike in the musical where Angelica sings, "My father has no son, so I'm the one who has to social climb for one," actually, there were 2 brothers that survived to adulthood. They did lose one sibling in infancy. So, Eliza went through loss when she was fairly young yet. Of course, she grew up and she became a grown woman during the Revolutionary War, where a lot of people were going to die. But she had the strength to deal with that. And she actually was a big help to her father and often accompanied him when he met various famous people. She became close friends with Martha Washington, a friendship that lasted throughout their lives. And she went with him when he went to speak to the Iroquois. And she actually had a very good relationship with them.
She accompanied her father on horseback for a days-long journey to the Iroquois Confederacy Council, where she learned weaving and planting from the Indians and also how to make wampum. She was formally adopted and given an Indian name that translated to mean "one of us."
Just a brief side note as someone who is proud to be part Cherokee. Please do not refer to any Native American nation as Indian. Really doesn't go over well. We're not from India. That name is completely wrong, and yeah. So, just a note there. But otherwise, I do love that clip shows just how good her relationship was with the Iroquois, especially for her to get the name "one of us." I mean, that tells how completely she was accepted and how highly they thought of her. And the Iroquois were extremely important during the Revolution because they had a decision to make over which side they were going to support. And Philip Schuyler hoped that he could convince them to at least not support the British if he wasn't going to be able to convince them to help his side. So relations with the Iroquois were very important to the Revolution. So Eliza learned a lot from them, and during this time she did what she could, helped her father, and she ended up traveling a fair bit, and at one point she was staying with her aunt. And everybody was getting together for a winter ball, and that's where she met Alexander. Eliza and Alexander had a whirlwind romance where they wrote love letters back and forth to each other, kept up the correspondence, and they were married on December 14th, 1780. Now, here's a bit of a twist. Eliza is the only one of her sisters to not elope. Angelica, Peggy, Catherine was another sister. They all went off and got eloped to get married. She's the only one where Alexander went to her father, said, "Hey, can I have permission to marry your daughter?" And they were absolutely devoted to each other, but life wasn't easy. There was a war on. Now, Hamilton, of course, was working as an aide-de-camp to Washington. And Eliza wrote to Washington with some big news, asking him to send Alexander home. She was going to have a baby. And at that time, Alexander and Washington had a little bit of a falling out anyway, and Washington did send Alexander home, although he was recalled to war before Philip was born. Eliza would actually have 8 children who made it to adulthood. She suffered 1 miscarriage, and she and Alexander would actually adopt another child besides. They adopted Frances, who was called Fanny Antill, who was the daughter of a friend of Alexander's. And everybody said that there was no difference in how she was treated as from their biological children. They considered her their daughter. End of it. That's it. She's one of the Hamilton family now. Eliza was devoted to her children, and she did her best to take care of them while managing the household. And after the war, life got extremely busy because Alexander, of course, became Secretary of the Treasury, which meant busy social life. So Eliza had to arrange parties and have people over for dinner and all that good stuff. So she was kept very busy, and she still found time to do charity work besides entertaining all these people. One famous example is when she had a portrait painted of herself, and I'm going to show you the portrait here. Here's why that portrait is so important. Alexander came home and he mentioned to Eliza, "Oh, there's this really great artist by the name of Ralph Earl, and he's currently in debtor's prison." Now, Eliza could have just given the money to bail this guy out, but that would have been a blow to his pride. So what she did instead was she went to the debtor's prison and said, "I've just got to have this portrait made of myself. I'll pay whatever you like." "Oh, enough to get you out of here. Okay." That's the kind of person Eliza was. She didn't just go for the big public charities, get her name in the paper, "Oh, Mrs. Hamilton donated to this cause," or was on the committee for that cause. She did a lot of private charity work that never made the papers, that was just something the people were grateful for. That's the kind of person she was. Of course, she lived a very public life. She had to, and that became very painful when Alexander was involved in the nation's first big sex scandal. Now, if you're familiar with the musical, you know that Alexander had an affair with a woman by the name of Maria Reynolds. And he was actually accused of embezzling government funds. Now, there's a longer story behind that. You see, Mariah's husband, James, had a buddy who found himself in legal trouble, and this is basically just a short, simple version of the story. But this is how that leaked. James Reynolds' buddy said, "Hey, you want to talk legal trouble? Alexander Hamilton is embezzling government funds." Not at all true, but suspicions were raised, and Alexander said, "No, that's not what's happening. I am paying for something, yes, but it's out of my own pocket. Every penny of that is mine, and I'm paying to basically shut up the husband of a woman that I was having sex with." Not good, but better than embezzling. Now, afraid of all this information leaking out, especially because James Monroe let a few nice little juicy details slip, Alexander decided to write what became known as the Reynolds pamphlet, detailing everything about the affair. He was hoping people would say, oh, he's honest. No, that didn't go as planned. And of course, Eliza dealt with a lot of shame as a result of this. You ever see somebody ruin their own life? This poor wife. Now, can you even imagine that? Not only does your spouse have an affair, but he writes a pamphlet giving all the embarrassing details to the entire world. I understand why he wrote it. I understand he wanted to make sure that he was not falsely accused of embezzlement. But it still had to be absolutely humiliating. The world has no right to my heart. The world has no place in our bed. Her anger and embarrassment and pain at this had to be terrible. Now, we don't know for sure, though, if this is when she burned the letters she'd written to Alexander. We do have some surviving letters that she wrote him. She didn't burn them all. But those that were lost may have been destroyed well before the Reynolds affair and for an entirely different reason. One minor quarreling point between Eliza and Alexander was she didn't think of herself as much of a writer, and Alexander would tell her, you really should write more. But here's something interesting. There are letters, documents that Alexander wrote, and parts of them are in Eliza's handwriting. Now, I don't believe she would have done a lot to drastically change what Alexander said, but I can easily see her saying, oh, hey, did you think of this idea? Or maybe you might want to say this instead of that. I could easily see that happening because Eliza was an incredibly intelligent, independent woman. And it wouldn't surprise me at all if she guided Alexander's writing a little bit. Good a writer as he was, I could easily see that happening. As embarrassing and terrible as this affair had to be for her, that would be nothing compared to what was coming up. In 1801, their eldest son Philip was killed in a duel. And only 3 years later, Alexander would die in a duel himself, the infamous duel against Aaron Burr. I can't even imagine Eliza finding the letter that morning saying what he had gone to do. In that letter, he closes it by using a phrase used in the musical that is often used when talking about Eliza. Hey, best of wives and best of women. Eliza loved Alexander enough to forgive him for the Reynolds affair. She'd gone through the pain of losing her son, and now she lost him. He died the day after the duel, surviving long enough to make it back to New York, and both Eliza and Angelica were with Alexander when he died. And that was just 2 of the deaths that she went through at this time. I'm going to read a bit here from the Chernow novel, from the biography of Hamilton that he wrote, the one that inspired the musical. He says, for Eliza Hamilton, the collapse of her world was total, overwhelming, and remorseless. Within 3 years, she had to cope with 4 close deaths. Her eldest son, her sister Peggy, her mother, and her husband. That's just so much grief in such a short time. And it would have been easily understandable if Eliza had just retreated into her house, said, I can't deal with this pain. I'm just going to take time out to grieve. But even though Eliza was in so much grief, She wasn't even physically able to attend Alexander's funeral, she was so grief-stricken. She made herself go on, and she created a remarkable legacy for herself after this. Stop wasting time on tears. I live another 50 years. Of course, at that point, Eliza didn't know she was going to have another 50 amazing years of life. She had to find a way to get by. Alexander had left some debts, and the only thing that she could do was to sell their beloved home, the Grange. They'd only had 2 years there together. But enough of Eliza's friends said, hey, we can't let her lose her home. They all went together and bought it for her and said, okay, you can buy it back from us at an extremely low price. So she got to keep her home. And here's an example of Eliza as an economist. She had a sofa that was getting worn out, should be replaced, and instead of just buying a new one, Eliza thought, I can embroider that. I'll make it better than new. She was known to be pretty handy with a needle and thread. So she found ways to get by. And then she went well beyond that to find ways to help others. As the musical points out, she raised money for the Washington Monument, and when it was dedicated, she got to ride with some pretty amazing people.
Lay the cornerstone for what we now know as the Washington Monument. She rode with President Polk and future presidents James Buchanan, Abraham Lincoln, and Andrew Johnson.
To me, it's pretty incredible that someone who lived through the Revolutionary War lived long enough to meet Lincoln. That's pretty incredible. Now, besides the Washington Monument, Eliza did a lot more good. She spoke out against slavery, and yes, her father Philip Schuyler did own slaves. That doesn't mean Eliza approved of that at all. And her father left his slaves to her in his will, and as soon as she could, she said, all of you are free. Slavery's not right. She gathered all of her husband's writings and spoke to his friends to get their stories of him to preserve his legacy. That was extremely important to her, that Alexander be remembered. She did everything she could to preserve his writings and to tell the story of his life. She didn't get to write an official biography of him, the way Ron Chernow did, but she made sure the information was all gathered and was all there. Now, one other thing that she did, and her proudest achievement, was she made the first private orphanage in New York City. It's estimated that she oversaw the education and care of over 700 children. That was an extremely important cause for her, especially because, of course, her husband had been an orphan. So that was something incredibly dear to her heart. And the orphanage she founded, while technically no longer an orphanage, we don't have those these days, is still in operation as the Graham Windham organization that helps underprivileged children. She would be very happy to know that. She did so much good work throughout her life, and then when she was in her 80s, she decided, you know what? I'm going to go to Wisconsin to visit my son. Her son William had moved to Wisconsin, which was a long journey from New York. And just think of all the difficulties of traveling back then. And here's an 80-year-old woman, a woman in her 80s rather, and she decides, I'm going to go take a trip.
Here she met the British scientist George Featherstone Haw. He recorded the meeting later and said, I found Mrs. Hamilton, the widow of the celebrated Alexander Hamilton. This lively old lady, now about 80 years old, told me that, knowing she might not live a long time to see the things of this world, she had determined to avail herself of the great facilities for traveling and pay a visit to her son, and having an inclination to see all she could, was determined to ascend the Mississippi to the St. Peters, Minnesota River. I cannot but admire her spirit and vivacity. Eliza's journey in total was 5 months, and she felt nothing but exhilarated.
To me, when Eliza reached this age, she was the definition of a cool old lady. She always maintained her kindness and her care for others. I think of Angelica singing in the musical, "You will never find anyone as trusting or as kind." But Eliza also had plenty of fire in her. And there was one person she never forgave for what happened with Alexander. James Monroe came to visit her later in her life, and she had a few choice words for him.
When she entered the house to meet him in the parlor, she did not offer him a drink or even a seat. Nonetheless, standing there, he offered to make amends. Her response to him was a quiet, "No lapse of time, no nearness to the grave makes any difference."
Eliza was definitely a spitfire of a woman. I find it amazing just the fact that she lived to be 97. At that time, that was nothing short of a miracle. She kept her fighting spirit and her love of life, her enthusiasm, all throughout everything that had happened to her. But by this point, she knew she'd lived a long time and she was ready to let go. And she wanted to be with her loved ones again, especially Alexander. And I'm going to read again from the Chernow novel here. She frequently grew melancholy and longed for a reunion with her Hamilton, as she invariably referred to him. And then a quote here from someone who knew her. "One night, I remember, she seemed sad and absent-minded and could not go to the parlor where there were visitors, but sat near the fire and played backgammon for a while. When the game was done, she leaned back in her chair a long time with closed eyes, as if lost to all around her. There was a long silence, broken by the murmured words, 'I am so tired. It is so long. I want to see Hamilton.'" On November 9th, 1854, Eliza got her wish and was reunited with Alexander. They're buried beside each other in Trinity Church, along with her sister Angelica, and very near to their son Philip. This is a woman who lived for 97 years. She lived through the Revolutionary War and almost lived to see the Civil War. That is mind-blowing. Add into that all she went through, all she accomplished, and the kind of life that she lived. And to me, she is one incredible lady who deserves a tribute. I hope you've enjoyed this video, and until next time, take care.